All right, it is 12:01. Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Danielle Aragoni. I'm Managing Director of Policy and Solutions here at National Housing Trust. We're really happy to have you with us today for our inaugural Insights on Housing webinar. A couple housekeeping items before I turn it over to our CEO. First of all, we are recording this event. We will post the recording after it has been completed, hopefully early next week. We will be doing this in sort of a salon style, discussion style format. So we very much invite and encourage your questions. Please drop those into the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And we're going to kick this off very shortly. So let me first turn it over to our CEO, Priya Jayachandran, who is going to in turn introduce our panelists. So again, thank you for joining us. Priya?
Thanks, Danielle. As Danielle mentioned, I'm Priya Jayachandran, and I have the pleasure of leading National Housing Trust. And I'm very excited to launch our new webinar series, Insights on Housing. We are planning on hosting a few of these over the coming year, including one on the intersection of affordable housing and sustainability, and another on the intersection of affordable home ownership and wealth creation. Theme is how do you both collaborate but also recognize the inherent tensions that we sometimes encounter in policy goals. But it's befitting that today we're starting with a conversation on preservation and housing preservation. National Housing Trust was founded almost 40 years ago, focused exclusively on affordable housing preservation. Back then, affordable housing preservation was the affordable housing crisis of our time, and the crisis was largely one of preserving affordability. We had subsidy contracts and regimes that had been instituted in the 50s, 60s, 70s, that in the 1990s were reaching the end of their original expiry, and NHT, along with lots of good partners, worked to preserve that affordability and extend it. Today, we argue that we have a preservation crisis once again, but it's a little different in nature. Clearly, we have to continue to work to extend affordability. That's important work, and things like the qualified contract and challenges to rights of first refusal of nonprofit owners are threats to long-term affordability. There are also really good and concerted collaborative efforts underway to highlight and combat those threats. I argue in a recent Shelterforce article that the bigger threat that eclipses other affordability threats for preservation are deteriorating conditions in affordable housing and the ensuing threats to affordable housing owners. Our system wasn't designed to operate, maintain, and repair affordable housing. And after the pandemic and after years of booming real estate cycles that have increased prices, it's meant that we have not done enough work to maintain our properties, and it's bubbling up and over today, with many of us struggling with subpar housing conditions and struggling operations, both at the property level and at the owner level. I've had the pleasure of working in affordable housing and community development finance for almost 30 years. And for me, this is the worst threat to housing operators and residents that I've experienced. Clearly, 2008 tried a lot of us, but largely that was confined to the financial system. And clearly there were interventions at the federal level. Here, residents and owners are struggling, and I don't think a bailout is coming anytime soon, and it's hard to see how we undo this or get out of it anytime soon. I do think it doesn't have to be that dire, and what I'm excited for, and NHT is is recommitting itself to is how do we change this trajectory? How do we draw more attention and more resources to that? But it's not clear cut. And really for us, where we get the most confidence and learning is from talking to people on the ground who think about these issues, experience them, and are as committed, if not more committed to them as we are. So I'm really excited today to join a conversation among 4 of our peers in the field who begin to think about these issues or experiencing them similarly or differently, and from whom we have a lot to learn. So I'm excited today to be joined by Deidre Schmidt, who leads CommonBond in the Twin Cities of Minnesota. Vincent Reina, Associate Professor at University of Pennsylvania and the founder and faculty director of the Housing Initiative at Penn. Bridgett Simmons, from staff attorney at the National Housing Law Project. And Alyia Gaskins, Senior Program Officer at Melville Charitable Trust, who was generous enough to underwrite some of NHT's preservation work. I think you've all joined the screen, but just want to welcome you to join. Thank you all, and let's get started. So I'm going to start with Deidre, Vincent, and Alyia. And Deidre, I'm going to turn to you first. How did we get here? How did it become so bad?
Yeah, Priya, you covered some of this in your introduction, but just a reminder for folks, the programs, both state and federal, that create the majority of affordable housing that we depend on now, are really, they were created to do one thing primarily, and that's to create new housing units. Capital subsidies that are designed to be offered in exchange for 15 years worth of affordability, and in some cases longer. But it's often overlooked that those same sources are not available to ensure proper operations over time. And there are insufficient resources to cover resident need. So rental subsidies are only serving, depending on who you ask, a quarter to a fifth of those who qualify for them. And so, I would observe that part of the situation that we're in now is that we are seeing what was really from the beginning a structurally insufficient set of policies and programs that have done, frankly, miraculous work for a long time, being under-resourced, showing the cracks, right, in the system that was established to create affordable housing, being under-engineered to ensure its ongoing viability, both from a physical improvement standpoint and from a true affordability for residents.
Thank you. Vincent, in addition to your academic work, you spent the last year or two at the White House Domestic Policy Council. Any insights from either body of work on how we got here?
For sure, yeah. And I wanted to take a step back and also maybe reiterate a couple of the points Deidre made in a slightly different way, though. So clearly there are high affordable needs, right? And in many ways, our subsidized housing in the country was not meant to be the only affordable housing options in markets as a whole, right? It was meant to be one piece of a larger puzzle. And the reality is there's, as we all know, a true lack of affordable housing across the country. One statistic I find particularly striking that I like to use here is, according to the Maricopa Association of Governments, in the Phoenix MSA, over 90% of rental units rented at less than $1,000 in 2010, right? And over 20% rented for less than $500. Whereas on the other end, less than 5% rented for over $1,500. So flash forward to 2023. In 2023, less than 10% of units rented for less than $1,000. This is a total inversion, right? So before, over 90% of units were below $1,000. By 2023, less than 10% of units were under $1,000. And essentially, there were nearly zero below $500, and well over half of the market rents for over $1,500. So what you see in the Phoenix MSA, which is not atypical, is a wholesale loss of the market rate affordable units, putting a lot more pressure on the subsidized units, essentially being the only affordable units in these markets, right? Combine that with, clearly, as Deidre said, there's not enough subsidy. From our own analysis, we have an interactive map at the Housing Initiative of Penn. 1 in 5 households eligible for a voucher actually received one and was able to use it. What's interesting is that, when we think of the story, we clearly always think of New York, California, those kinds of markets, and those have the most eligible households in need of a voucher. But if you actually look at like the share of renters that are eligible for a voucher, you see interesting dynamics where even states like Wyoming, Montana actually have the highest share of eligible renters who are not able to access a voucher, right? And so that's really striking to kind of both show the depth, but the reality that it spans the whole country in really different ways. And as Priya started off, we know that the housing stock is aging and subsidies are expiring, right? And so a lot of the concern about subsidy expiration is often the idea of owners will leave these properties and they'll no longer be affordable. The reality is that a lot of owners actually are trying to stay in these programs, but there's serious rehabilitation needs, right? And so what we're seeing, for instance, in Philadelphia alone, over 20% of the currently federally subsidized stock is due to expire in the next 10 years. So again, that doesn't mean all of those are looking to convert to affordable housing, but it does mean that all those units are in need of recapitalization. So what we're seeing increasingly is the direct competition between preservation and new construction at a scale that we've never seen before, where essentially you can start seeing 100% of your tax credits being used just to actually preserve the existing affordable housing stock that we've built over years. And that's a real tension. So I know my colleagues here can speak more to the actual operating cost change and those things, but I think those macro contexts really show the real constraints that owners are facing in the market, and particularly in the subsidized housing space.
Thank you. Alyia, you bring a perspective not only as a funder, but also from local government. You are an elected city council person from Alexandria, Virginia. Any insights from either of those two vantages of what got us here? How did it get so bad?
Yes, and thank you for the question. As you have stated, and those who spoke before me, we are clearly living at a time where affordable housing is, less available, it's less attainable, it's hard to find, and there's just a whole range of challenges. When I started thinking about what got us here, I was I guess reading through some old papers from when I was working on my master's in urban planning. And I remember in every housing related class, we always talked about kind of the 3 Ps of housing. And it was always a little picture with a stool, and you had production, preservation, and protection. And I think years ago as a student, I think you think of it as, oh, that means everything's equal. Every community is putting in resources on all 3 legs. And it's just this perfect balance that holds it up. What I have seen as an elected official and as a funder is that that's not the case. When there are scarce resources, when there are competing priorities, when there are political pressures, you often see a stool that's pretty much about to tip over. And I think some of the larger things that have gotten us here are, one, there's a perception, I think, about preservation. Preservation is not the sexy thing. It's not the ribbon cutting that you go to. It's not the number you can quote of new units that you were able to pass during your term. And so I think it's always kind of then competing against some of these other projects in pipelines that are stalled and that you're trying to get moving forward. I'd say the other thing that, none of us really could predict, but is putting significant pressure on the situation we have, is related to climate change. A lot of these older buildings, not only were they not built to last this long, but now when they are facing more intense storms, days that are much hotter than anyone could have ever predicted, you now have this old infrastructure that is trying to respond to flooding, trying to respond to heating and cooling demands in ways that it was never intended to do. And I think that continues to put additional strain on the system. I'd say another piece, at least what I see in Alexandria, because of the larger affordability challenges we have in the community, you're seeing a lot of overcrowding. And so units that were meant for maybe, 2 to 3 people actually have 7 or 8 people in it. And so that's also a strain on the building and sort of what you're able to maintain and keep up. And then the last piece I would say that I think is part of this larger conversation is just, especially with the pandemic and high rates of inflation, people are struggling to keep up with the rent. And if there isn't, the rent coming in, or there isn't that constant cash flow, that also then impacts the ability of operators to not just maintain the current building, but do some of these necessary improvements, and are leading to some of the crisis levels and crisis situations that we're seeing.
Thank you. Clearly, these dynamics have impacts on both residents and owners, and what we're trying today is to try and unpack some of that and figure out, I don't think it's as binary as sometimes it's portrayed, but more of a spectrum. But let's start with the resident perspective. Bridgett, how are these challenges impacting residents?
Yeah, thanks for, so first, just thank you to NHT for the opportunity to participate in today's conversation. And just kind of touching on the first question and the second, I just also want to interject that years of calling Black women welfare queens and their children welfare babies have a consequence, not just on Black mothers and their children, but on all of those who are seeking and are in need of subsidized housing, all of those who are in need of affordable housing, communities in need of affordable housing. And we know that to be true because in 1973, there was a cap on housing, on what the federal government spent and contributed towards housing. And so I would just say, the narrative and the stereotyping and the just frankly, the abuse of the people who federal housing programs serve has allowed us to get to this point in time, right? And so while we're in this crisis, it's very obvious that these housing programs are vital public tools and services to our community members of all races, of all backgrounds, right? But just to hold space for at the foundation of our housing system, it is to oppress people, to be to segregate and to racialize folks and to treat them differently based on how they present or how they look. And so I just want to interject that into one of the reasons why we find ourselves in this space that we find ourselves. In terms of tenants' experience, I just also want to give a little context about myself and the work that I do and how I do it. So I am with the National Housing Law Project, and we don't provide direct legal representation to tenants. We support attorneys who do that work. We support attorneys in their litigation, also through their administrative advocacy. We also provide policy support at various government levels. And so while I don't necessarily work directly with tenants, I do have relationships and try to take my lead from those national groups that are tenant-led. And so the experiences that I'm sharing with you today are just frankly those experiences that I've learned from my colleagues and have been so grateful to have those experiences shared with me. And so obviously one of the things that's already raised on the call is the increase of rent, right? So as the rent increases, especially during the pandemic, when folks maybe lost employment or their employment decreased, in terms of hours, folks struggle to keep up with the rent. In addition to keeping up with the rent, they frankly, as mentioned earlier, are struggling to keep up with the cost of living, the cost of groceries. If you have a family member that has underlying health issues, those costs have gone up, right? Transportation costs. So the costs just existing in this world today cost quite a bit more money. And we know wages aren't necessarily keeping up with the cost of living. I would say in terms of thinking about some shared struggles when conditions was raised. So like when it is just frankly too expensive or homeowners or developers cannot excess capital to reinvest into their property. The people who suffer are the tenants who live in those properties, especially if they have underlying health conditions that are aggravated by poor housing conditions, right? So this could be anything from mold, rodents. It spans the gambit, right? And then the other thing that I think we don't think about, and so trying to keep it short, is like the changes in services, right? So if a management agent has been there and built community with residents, and then because of budgets or changing in prices or whatever the reason, the management agent leaves, right? Like there is this loss in community member and relationship, right? And even though these are properties and assets that belong to private entities, we also have to hold space that these properties are also folks' homes, they're folks' communities, and that really means something. And we have to really acknowledge that, especially in how we provide services. So I mentioned management, but also like service providers who are in communities providing services to folks who live in those buildings. The disruption in that community can be really detrimental, especially when we're talking about management. And particularly management and subsidized portfolios, right? The management is doing or typically is doing research, which impacts how much of a subsidy a family will receive. And so these changes in relationship can be very difficult, right? Especially if there isn't a rapport, like I mentioned before, or institutional knowledge about the building and particularly about tenants and their particular situation. So that's just a short view. There are many more, but I'll stop there.
Thank you. Deidre, what about owners? How are these preservation operating challenges impacting and showing up for owners?
Yeah. You know, I'll start just to say that I agree with everything Bridgett said. And to say that, you know, the majority of our staff have some sort of affinity to our residents. We share life experience with our residents. You know, I'm not the only CommonBond employee who grew up in affordable housing, who has experience living in a low-income community. Most of us who have become engaged in this work have done so not because it's, you know, where we could build even the strongest career or make the most money. It's because we felt it was important to continue to give back to our communities. So tagging on to what Bridgett was saying, the kinds of issues that she just pointed out, they impact the resident community and they impact the broader community and they impact our staff. And so one of the things I would say is that a major element for us in this crisis is the impact on our ability to staff. Our staff feel a sense of moral injury right now working in these current times. It is difficult to show up to work when you know that your properties do not have sufficient resources to continue upkeep. When you know that social services that we provide in our portfolio have had to be reduced because only 10% of the funding that we need to provide those services comes from any evergreen source of funding. So there is a damage to the fabric of our community, both in the resident community, the community of staff, and the broader system that is engaged in this work. To speak probably more to what you were hoping I'd offer in terms of owner perspective on this, the place where I think it's easiest for folks to understand where resident distress and owner distress overlap most soundly is in resident difficulty in paying rent. So, you know, I'll take our portfolio for an example. In 2023, a full 15% of our households were technically eligible for eviction under our pretty generous definition of eviction eligibility. That's a high point in our entire 50-some years of existence. That required of us a completely different level of staff time and investment in order to walk alongside residents who were facing that difficulty of meeting their rent obligations, working with them to access emergency rental assistance, fundraising for private resources to bring as an additional resource for residents that had fallen through the cracks of emergency rental assistance of various types. And I'm really pleased to say that, of the over 1,000 households that were eligible for eviction last year, we ended up having to take that step only for 50 households. 50 households is 50 too many, I want to be clear, but it is not without significant effort that we were able to avert eviction in 950 of those households. The reason why that piece is so important for everyone to understand is that rents are our only source of funding to keep properties up to the standards that we would like and what residents and communities have come to expect from us, to provide social services, to keep staffing levels at a point that that serves genuinely the resident and the property needs, and to avert turnover. And so, so when we see residents struggling so mightily to pay their portion of the rent or to secure rent subsidy, which is, as we've said a couple times already, not available to everyone who qualifies, that lack of resources is reinforces a downward spiral. It means that we have to consider reducing office hours and staffing levels, cutting services programs, putting off, delaying necessary upkeep that is essential for us to maintain the quality that we expect and our residents deserve. And so everything that Bridgett said is absolutely a central concern also of owners.
Thank you. As I mentioned earlier, I find that the media often portrays it as an either or, that there's support for helping residents or there's help for supporting owners, that owners are bad and residents are good, or vice versa. But listening to you two and in our own experience, it's much more nuanced than that. How can we change that narrative, and how can residents and tenant advocacy groups and owners and owner advocacy groups come together, and what are some of the shared solutions? Bridgett, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so I'll just kind of circle back where I started. This narrative about housing and federal funding are very closely tied. As Vince said, subsidized, in particular, the federal subsidized housing portfolio, it was only intended to be a portion of the affordable housing stock. But, advocacy at all levels is really necessary. And so I would just say, like, one of the solutions that I'm thinking about is just how powerful it would be if there's this collective block of tenants, developers, and others who are in the affordable housing space who are moving in a collective direction, saying to all levels of government, affordable housing is so essential to the health and the wealth of our community, and we really need to reinvest and increase the amount of funding that we are contributing towards not only new development, but also preservation. Your article beautifully described the benefits of preservation, right? So like it's cost effective, you're honoring oftentimes the historical architecture and culture of a community. And so I just, but in order to get there, that requires community building. And so the other solution and ways in which I believe is important for tenants and ownership entities to have to build common ground is to start building that community. So really being intense and oh my goodness, I'm sorry, I'm losing my words. Being really in collaborative and speaking to tenants, like, and hearing about what type of services they would like to provide. If you can't provide them, trying to determine if there's a partner in the community who can provide those services, right? So providing, seeing home as an anchor institution where all of your needs and your social needs, medical needs, other type of needs are met. And, one of the ways that we see that happening or attempting to or we encourage that to happen is through tenants organizing at their building, right? So tenants are organizing themselves, understanding what their issues are, what their experiences are, and going through that process and then presenting that to owners. And so we're always at NHLP encouraging owners to work collaboratively with tenants, especially in instances where the property is troubled, right? And so, really honoring that opportunity to work collaboratively to get to a point of solution for specific properties. But I think in a larger scale, we all need to get to a place of trust and collaboration in order to shift how we're funding and how we view how we provide housing.
Thank you. Deidre, anything on your side that you see of places of potential collaboration and co-solving?
Yeah. I'll just make an observation that has been becoming clearer and clearer to me is that, when we engage with residents, which we do often and in various forms, I've come to understand that we are, as an owner operator of affordable housing and a social service provider, we are oftentimes the face of systems failure. So, and I do not fault residents at all for that, right? But I have observed that, the fact that rents are not, for most people, adjusted to true affordability for a household, that is perceived by residents as being the fault of the landlord, the thought of organizations like mine, when we are not properly resourced to do the recapitalization that's necessary in our properties, and properties deteriorate. It makes sense that residents look to us to say, why aren't you maintaining this property in the way that I feel I deserve? And when we aren't able to offer social services at the same level consistently because of the fluctuations of philanthropic funding and individual donations, we are held accountable by residents for those changes. And it makes sense to me why that is the case. We are that fulcrum. We are the relationship where the system that hasn't been properly engineered and funded over decades, to what Bridgett was talking about, we are the face of that system to a lot of people. And so one piece for me that that I think is important in all of this is to make sure that we are educating around what you started this seminar with. How did we get here? What is going on behind the scenes of a landlord? Particularly, I think there's a special role for nonprofit landlords in this dialogue. I hope, can be a more trusted and credible partner in an education process both ways. We can help residents understand the limited places where we have control and who they can help us hold accountable. And we can also help electeds and professional staff of cities and counties and states and federal governments understand how the chronic underfunding and improper structuring of these systems is impacting their constituents, their voters. So I hope that we can continue to build on this sense of partnership and ability to be, as nonprofit owner operators, specifically, a much more powerful partner along with residents.
In that lifting up that Deidre talks about, Alyia, what can and should we be lifting up about the impact of this housing crisis on the existing stock on communities, whether in Alexandria or elsewhere? What are the spillover effects that it's having at the community level?
Yes, no, I think that's such a great question. And I guess I'd approach it in a couple different ways. First and foremost, and I think Bridgett and Deidre did a great job of just outlining the way we are seeing that spillover impact our individual residents and the stories that are being told from our residents at our public hearings, on the media about just some of the conditions they're facing. I think where we then see that spillover in the larger community, I think one is in terms of how the city has to respond and the amount of resources it then takes for that response. So I can tell you in the city of Alexandria, we just passed our FY25 budget, and there's additional funding in there for rental assistance. There's new additional funding for code enforcement because our code enforcement staff can't keep up and they're being called more frequently. But the other challenge is they're being called and, the owners are able to do maybe a temporary solution, but then they're going to be called back the next week, or they're going to be called the next time a pipe bursts, or the next elevator outage, or the next thing that happens. And we just don't have the staffing levels to keep up with that. So now we're having to put more resources in to be able to respond. We're also seeing the city government having to create other programs. So our health department has created programs where they're starting to bring in filters, where they're doing mold screenings, where there are other things that, again, these are all resources that I think if we were getting at the root of the issues and maybe finding new ways to partner to address the root of the problem, we wouldn't then be putting so much money that's honestly not enough in each of these buckets to all of these kind of more band-aid solutions. I'd say another spillover that we see that I think is important for all of us to keep our eye on is this is happening within a larger conversation about housing affordability within communities. And I can tell you what I have seen is when we get ready to, pass a new development, or when we were having our conversation about zoning for housing, which was our largest package of zoning reforms, there were people who came and they would testify and they would call out some of our older apartment buildings and would say, well, this is what you're building, or this is how you want people to live. I mean, I think we had an issue where somebody even referred to it as where we're creating tenement housing, but then that becomes this narrative that then becomes really hard to then fight and push for any type of additional housing resources. And to Bridgett's earlier point, it also then feeds into these narratives and these horrible stereotypes we have about people who need affordable housing, how they live, what that housing looks like in our community. In terms of, I think, things that we can lift up that seem like bright spots or ways to kind of move forward. In the city of Alexandria, we have the Alexandria Eviction Partnership. And this is a monthly partnership meeting that pulls together landlords, it pulls together tenants, but it also pulls together city officials as well as legal aid services, our sheriff's department, and then probably kind of unlikely folks such as the lawyers for some of these large property management companies. It pulls together others who are in our faith-based communities or who are helping to try and put together some of the response when things begin to fall apart. And I think these have been really powerful conversations because they start with the data. So it starts with, here are the different properties, here are the rates of evictions we're seeing across the city from each of these different properties. And then there are sub-work groups with tenants and landlords to kind of talk about, why are we seeing that? Why is so-and-so property number one this month? What else is happening there? And are there city, community, and other resources that can come together to try and stop that? And then also, we sometimes take it offline and there's a case-by-case basis where you're actually working to find what's the individual plan that residents might need in order to help support their stability. And I think creating spaces for those tough conversations and then having the data in front of everyone to be able to hold each partner at the table accountable is really important for how we think of ways to move forward.
Thank you. Vincent, either from Philadelphia or from the White House, you saw communities all across the country. You started about Maricopa. How do you see this playing out at a community scale?
Yeah, so I mean, what's interesting is, again, kind of going back to the point that this often then becomes the few affordable units left in many communities. They're like there's multiple tensions placed in this scenario, right? So one, there's a scenario where the numbers just don't work and the market's appreciating. And owners say, look, the numbers don't work. I'm just going to exit these programs, right? So you can essentially lose affordability and access by owners opting out of subsidy programs going forward, which have clear community-wide impacts, right? On the other end, you could have essentially properties that are failing out, right? And so that's where the numbers really don't work, but the owners says, I'm going to keep pushing through, right? Interestingly, as everyone here knows well, there's no housing quality inspection system-wide in most cities, right? But all of our subsidized housing programs have these inspections for rightful reasons to ensure a certain level of housing quality, right? And so you could see properties essentially failing out of affordable housing programs and maybe even becoming market rate affordable housing and then not subject to any form of inspections or really kind of heavy regulations to improve housing quality, which there then affects all the residents in that building, but also then clearly affects the overall neighborhood property values, investments, things like that, right? I think, the point that both Deidre and Alyia made is a really important one, though, is that, when you get into this loop, you could potentially get into a scenario where these buildings perpetuate the negative stereotypes of subsidized housing, right? And what that does is Alyia said this perfectly, it then helps make the case for why we shouldn't fund these programs when in fact we should, right? I think Deidre, your exact phrase of saying subsidized housing becomes the face of systems failure is a really kind of key part, right? Because we're holding it to these kind of high important thresholds of what we think housing should be. But if the systems aren't working to allow it to be that, then it becomes the face of those failures, but then everyone associated just with the program itself. So when we think about kind of them making the case for subsidized housing, making the case for these developments, we're really hurt, right? If they're if there's a property in distress that everyone thinks about when they first think of these realities. So clearly kind of there's a lot of negative potential spillovers if a property goes into disrepair. That could be community-wide, loss of property values, right? Impacts on local investments, on potential crime exposure, things along those lines. But all to say is I think one of the biggest struggles you'll see is that a community's kind of case for making the need for investment can often actually be hurt by this kind of challenge of this dynamic that we're talking about here.
Thanks. Let's pivot now to solutions. What would it take? What are the financial and policy solutions to address and reverse this decline? And Vincent, I'm going to start with you this time.
So clearly, coming from the federal, there's kind of robust proposals out there for more support, right? Expansion of the tax credit program, dramatic expansion of the voucher program. In the president's budget this year, so this is in my personal capacity. There's really exciting proposals about a housing supply fund, right? To actually invest in housing supply, but they're really kind of pushing on innovation that hopefully creates more financing products that actually increase the supply of housing. I think there's a lot of potential opportunities to think about our subsidies in different ways, right? So one of the things we talked a lot about was how do we use Section 108 loans in proactive ways to actually invest in properties that are viable, right? The basic notion of a 108 loan is that it's just a security, right? You're never actually supposed to default on it. If you do, there's the CDBG funds, but those kinds of tools, how do we maybe reimagine some of those other tools that we weren't putting in this context here? Some regulations might not allow that, but I think there's actually a lot of opportunity for regulations to allow that. I think there's increased flexibility in the voucher program and some kind of ways of rethinking the administrative costs and burdens in that program that I think actually make it layer on really well to other programs. There's been some improvements to the home program and just the way it operates. There's a proposed rule out right now that people can comment on. Right, home is a really important form of subordinate debt that a lot of people use to actually make investments in properties and make properties more affordable, right? Those comment periods are really important because making our programs work better is really important for then also making the case for these programs. So I would say that, and I would also just say, there's a lot of really exciting thought processes and best practices going on. And I think the conversation here about kind of partnerships between tenants and owners to kind of come to collective solutions is a real key part of this, right? And not kind of treating the two parties as diametrically opposed and in opposition, but acknowledging that there's actually like a shared interest in the outcome here, right? And not to idealize it, but to say that there are real opportunities to leverage it. And I think increasingly, a lot of instances, thanks to folks like Deidre, thanks to work from people like Bridgett and Alyia, right, that are kind of showing it is viable and that actually can lead to kind of better outcomes in the long term.
Thank you. Alyia, thoughts on potential solutions?
Yeah, a couple come to mind. First, I do want to just lift up the work, Priya, that you and NHT are doing to, through your multi-year campaign to both kind of make sure that people are aware of the size of the problem that we face. Because I often think, people just aren't aware of the preservation challenges happening in every community. And I think the more you guys are starting to put out that message and put real numbers behind it, I think that's going to be helpful in raising awareness. I also think the work you're doing to pull together some of the national organizations and align their strategies and their advocacy to make a case for preservation is going to be important so that we're not just seeing new resources open up at the federal, state, and local level, but we're seeing resources and programs that are actually tailored to the problem we're trying to solve. That's one. I'd say just piggybacking on what Vincent said at the federal level, I also would say just keeping our eyes open on a lot of the money that's coming out related to climate resilience and energy efficiency. I think that that has to be a part of the conversation, and those dollars can be critical when we're thinking about kind of utility costs and other energy savings in some of the older properties that we're talking about. At the local level, what I'm seeing is just solutions I want to explore more are around, are there ways that when we think about, replacing an elevator, replacing HVAC, or some of these larger maintenance costs, are there ways that the municipality or partners with philanthropy might be able to help cover the cost of some of those repairs. And in return, there maybe be agreements related to keeping units affordable for a longer period of time, or there's some other structure that becomes a win-win where we might be able to put resources out more quickly, get that repair taken care of, that because of that cost saving or because of the property owner not having to do that, there may be other ways that then that could be reinvested back into residents and to the property itself. So I think all of those are some interesting opportunities for us to keep our eye on and really see how we pull in partners from the private sector, from philanthropy, and from the public sector to really pool those resources.
Bridgett? Wish list, magic wand?
So we're gonna piggyback off of Vince. I think that's the trend. So I would just kind of to Vince's point about like making sure these programs work more efficiently. Federal dollars are really scarce resources, and here to all that's been said. And I'm sure these type of folks that I'm about to talk about are on the call, but there are some folks who are in these federal programs who have no good intention of taking care of properties, taking care of people. And so it's really important that the public and other stakeholders who are in this space, that we put pressure on these federal agencies to do better, like in their oversight and who is coming into these programs and how they're maintaining these properties. Because even though we have many, many owners who are kind and caring and want to do the right thing, we just know there are folks who are in the sea who are getting these subsidies who don't want to do the right thing. The other piece I just want to back to an earlier piece that Alyia was talking about was like these regional compacts and like different stakeholders who are locally working on housing issues coming together to just like say, this is what we're seeing. What do you know about this property? Or what do you know what's happening over here? It has been tremendously valuable to communities that have those type of compacts who are looking ahead at the type of risks that we're talking about in terms of opt-outs or troubled assets, right? And so having that type of intentionality, which was the word I was struggling with earlier, in a community is really, really valuable to ensure that the affordable housing is needed. the housing need in the community is met.
Thanks, Bridgett. Deidre?
I'll, ditto the pieces that have been discussed on the federal side. I'll give a few examples of some things that are happening here in my home state of Minnesota that I'm really excited about, that are in response to the things we're talking about today. The first was that in last legislative session, the Minnesota legislature approved a set of funding that was available to nonprofit housing and service providers, essentially to help us through these difficult times when all of these dynamics are going on. I can tell you from our organization's perspective, we have been able to continue our social services program because of that funding. That was a direct kind of appropriation. But there's also now, this year, a really important element. Our state is making a special pool of resources that is going to be dedicated specifically to recapitalization. And I think that's really important. That I can't remember, maybe it was Vincent earlier who said, we're having to compete. We're putting the reinvestment in our existing housing in a competitive environment against the production of new. And we have to break out of that. Our organization, 2/3 of the development work we have done in the last 10 years has been in the already existing portfolio. And yet we still have unmet needs. And so if you don't have a designated source to reinvest in the portfolio that exists, it will decline, as Alyia has outlined. There was a sales tax that was created in our metro area of the Twin Cities that is specifically for housing. And that sales tax is going to be split between helping do development and recapitalization and a rental assistance program, a locally funded rental assistance program. In the absence of federal action that I think, we're all kind of tired of talking about, local and state governments are really stepping up to say, if the federal government isn't going to step into that void, then we will. And I applaud those efforts. And then for organizations like ours, we got incredible support from Hennepin County and the city of Minneapolis to add additional units to an existing affordable housing development in the central city of Minneapolis, which is a great example of how, if you have a supportive local government, flexibility in zoning and approvals, entitlements that are required, and a set of resources that you can bring to bear, you can actually address the recapitalization and physical improvement and staffing needs of an existing housing community while also adding to the housing stock, because of course we know that's important. And the last piece is just in partnership between owners and residents. I do not pretend like we have the answers there. We really struggle with this. And one thing I can think that would help us immensely is philanthropic and government support for staff time to invest in these kinds of relationships, because they don't happen without physical presence, the time to have dialogue. And I will just say, in these past 4 years, it has probably been the most stressful and strained environment between organizations like ours and residents who call our properties homes that I have ever seen in my 30-some years of doing this work. So we would love to be further supported in being able to invest time to do that right and with real integrity.
Thank you. In the chat and Q&A, Peter Tatian asked the question that, paraphrasing, while he appreciates the need for residents and owners to collaborate, his experience is that it's becoming increasingly difficult to do so, and that becomes a lot of finger pointing on both sides, given the structural challenges that Deidre and others highlighted. Do you all have any specific experiences and specific examples about collaborative solutions? And I'll just highlight, we're 5 minutes out, so probably maybe a 1 minute if you have examples.
I mean, so I would say, I mentioned earlier compacts. I think when I saw this question in the chat, that was one of the things that I thought of. You know, the compacts are really helpful in, I think, in my opinion, like being mediator in between those two parties. But really, frankly, it starts with building trust before you have this emergency and this rush to whatever the solution is to preserve a property or to get it to another preservation purchaser. That trust has to be built very early. But like if there's a trusted community entity that can be a neutral party to help, you know, these conversations about developing a mutually beneficial plan, that would be my second suggestion, like a trusted community partner.
I'll highlight, oh, go ahead, Vincent.
Yeah, and sorry, this might be a little too abstract, but I just wanted to make sure people knew there was a $10 million NOFO that HUD put out for tenant capacity building and organizing. And those kinds of funds are really rare. To Deirdre's point, actually having the funding and support to create those spaces is really unique and hard at the federal level. So the fact that $10 million of HUD funding for existing subsidized housing is essentially out there to do this kind of stuff is really important, right? It's not the sole solution, right? There's role for philanthropy and other sources that are much more flexible and nimble and able to even maybe be responsive to those tense moments. You know, in Philadelphia here, there was a very contentious opt-out that happened of a Section 8 property. A lot of tenant engagement, an owner who was not looking to stay in the program, and there were a lot of local resources that flowed in and political support to help try to mediate it. Wouldn't say it's a best practice of the way things were done. It took a long time. It took a lot of people's time. A lot of people moved and were displaced before the preservation actually any kind of movement was able to happen. But all to say is, I think, you know, in those spaces, the funding to actually kind of support both the tenants and the owners and the independent organizations that do that work and building it, as much as that funding could come in earlier on, the better off things are. And so hopefully that HUD funding is just a drop in the bucket, but I think it's a really critical example of the resources that can be used in this space.
Alyia?
Thanks. And I'll go really quick because I know we're almost at our time boundary. I was just going to pick up on this piece about trust. I think trust also has to be shown through accountability. And one example that we had in our city is we worked with an advocacy group and tenants as well as the landlords. And there was a lot of back and forth about repairs and whether or not repairs were being done on a timely basis. And in this case, we were able to actually go through the user experience of what it was like to actually put, you know, something in the maintenance portal, what happens on the back end when it's received. We identified a number of issues related to language, translation, and we're able to work with the property manager to actually set up somebody in their lobby so that if someone came, they could actually type it in for them right there. They get a printout. And so there's an accountability piece. But then we did kind of regular check-ins where the landlord would then, the property owner would then show, here are the open cases. Our code enforcement department would then work with them on what is the plan for each of these cases. The tenants who were quite frustrated about the previous process were then getting updates. So it took a while, but I think we had to start there to be able to show, okay, each of us is actually trying to fix this, and actually having those, you know, pieces of paper or things that we could follow up with. You forget how like having that tangible thing then shows people, okay, this is what we're working around. And if it's not getting done, then here's why it's not getting done. So all that to say, it's going to be a messy, complicated process, and we're just starting there. There's still bigger issues to fix, but I think it's through that we're then able to have those more difficult conversation because we have some proof points of like where things are changing.
Okay, we're at time, so I'm going to do one 5-second question for all of you to close us out. Looking into the future, what's the cost of inaction? Deidre? You're muted.
Almost made it through the whole webinar. The cost of inaction is continued degradation of the brand that we have all worked decades to create. Another cost of inaction is the loss of housing resources to obsolescence and sale and removal from programs. And the third is the potential loss of organizations, mission-based nonprofit organizations who are committed to doing this work in community, who may cease to be financially viable.
Thanks. Bridgett?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say this housing crisis can get a lot worse, and we will ultimately see an increase in homelessness and, just this housing situation can get just a lot worse. It would if we
Vincent?
Yeah, I mean, to Bridget's point, I think the reality is if our subsidized housing programs can't work, then where do people go, right? And what kind of housing can we provide? And so we run a real risk there of essentially destroying the viability of the limited tools we have, hurting the case for those tools that have real severe implications for those who desperately need housing.
And Alyia, close us out.
The primary mission of the Melville Charitable Trust is to end homelessness. The reason why we became interested in this work that the National Housing Trust is doing and this conversation is because we know that you cannot end homelessness if people don't have a home. And so I think Bridgett said it best, that if we do nothing, then we are going to see, we are already in a crisis. I don't know what's worse than a crisis, but we're going to continue to see it get worse and worse. And we're going to see more people just living on the streets in our community because there's no place to house them.
Thank you all. As one of the attendees wrote in the chat, we could have spent 90 minutes or more on this. It was a lot to pack into 60 minutes, but you all did a great job. Thank you for joining us. Check out NHT's website for more resources and stay tuned for further episodes of Insights on Housing. Thank you.